makes him sad to see the way we live. He'll always say, I forgive.
Good evening, Glen Springs Church family. I pray that you and your family at home are doing well. Nathan Ward is our summer series speaker tonight. He will be presenting his third lesson from the book of Esther. We appreciate Nathan very much and have greatly enjoyed the presentations and all his study from the book of Esther. So thank you very much, Nathan. Before we get into our lesson, let me give you a quick update of where we are on returning to the building for assemblies. We've now had 2 Sundays where we've gathered here at the building. We had 60 that first Sunday a couple of weeks ago, and this past Sunday we had 69 who gathered at the building. So space and social distancing is certainly not a problem right now. Altogether, 100 members of our church family have contacted me or the elders to let us know that they would be willing to come back and to join us in assemblies here at the building. And I'd like to say to that crowd, thank you. Thank you so much for your kindness and the mercy that you're showing to follow the guidelines to come and be a part of our assemblies. I'd also like to say you do not need to contact us every week and let us know, or if you will, put your name on our RSVP list. Once you've let us know that you want to come back, that list is set, and so that just gives us an idea of how many we could expect if everybody came. So that number right now is about 100, and also we believe that that number is manageable with respect to space that we have at the building. Tonight, your shepherds will actually be meeting and talking about the possibilities of even opening it up to more, especially to families who have children under 2. At this moment, we have a restriction that everybody wears a mask. Well, we're strongly considering following the CDC guideline that under 2 does not need to wear a mask. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. And so look for some communication, probably in the form of an email later this week, as we continue to assess what we can do to meet here at the building safely. Now, to all of you who do not feel comfortable about gathering in crowds, even if a crowd is going to wear masks and try to do our best to social distance, please do not feel any pressure. We do not want to put any burdens on you at all. The virtual assemblies will continue, and so I want to say a special thank you to all the men and all those who've been participating in those virtual assemblies for the time and effort with study and the time and effort that it takes to record a message and send it in. So thank you very much. So to all of you who are still choosing to stay at home, that is fine. Please continue to do so. Do what you need to do to feel safe. The virtual assemblies will continue. And as always, if there's anything that we can do for you, any suggestions, just anything at all, please do not hesitate to let us know. Okay, let's go to our Heavenly Father in prayer, and then we'll dig into the book of Esther and study at the feet of Nathan Ward. Our loving Father, thank you. Thank you for your love and your care for us. And dear Lord, even at a time like this in which we are certainly being challenged in many ways and having to spend time apart, we feel your presence and we know that you're with us. And dear Lord, we can clearly see that in the book of Esther. And so help us to gain the courage and the faith and the perseverance that we see in this wonderful book, and that we can see certainly not only in the faith of Esther, but also in Mordecai. And we thank you for Nathan and his efforts. But dear Lord, at this time, we just thank you for our church family. And we pray that you'll be with each and every family, that each and every family may continue to prosper spiritually, even at a time like this. And dear Lord, we also pray that at a time like this, that you will use us to be your servants to a world that desperately needs your peace. We thank you, dear Lord, for your truth, and be with us now as we get into your word. And we ask all this through the name of our Savior, Jesus the Christ, the true Prince of Peace. Amen. Enjoy the study.
Hello again. Welcome to the last of the lessons I'm going to be covering on the book of Esther. I don't want to spend too much time by way of preamble because what I'm going to try to do in this recording is something that I've spent as much as 4 individual classes doing, and I don't think anybody wants me to go that long in one recording. So I'm going to try to be brief and work through this in kind of an overview format. But what we're going to be talking about are the characters themselves in the book of Esther, and what we can know about them from the story itself and how that helps us then understand the story better. We'll spend the least time probably talking about Esther. She is the one that I did a character study on for a lesson for you guys a few years ago now. I'll hit the high points of that by way of review, but hope that at least some of you remember that well enough, or maybe that recording is still around somewhere if you need further fleshing out of that. And then spend our time talking about the other 3, Mordecai, Ahasuerus, and Haman. As we talk about Esther and who she is, what's most noteworthy about her is that she is a changing character throughout the story. She begins as someone who is completely passive. And this is shown in a variety of ways. If you look at Esther in Esther chapter 2, she does what people tell her to do. She goes where people tell her to go. She listens to everyone's advice and obeys unquestioningly. She is grammatically passive as well. Constantly, she is the object of passive verbs in Esther chapter 2. You have no comment about her feelings on what's going on or what she thinks about anything or what she does about anything. She's a complete wallflower of a character upon being moved about on someone else's chessboard for their purposes, and obedient to Mordecai, obedient to Haggai, obedient to Ahasuerus. That's just who she is. In chapter 4, she begins to think for herself. And this is something of the end of one stage and the beginning of the other, when she begins doing things like sending clothing out to Mordecai when he's lamenting the edict that has been signed, when she orders her eunuch to do something which presumably she's done many times before, but the first time you read about her doing anything in the story, you get insight into her fears about going before the king without being asked because of the law about what could happen in regard to that. When Mordecai tells her to do something, instead of unquestioningly obeying as she had always done before, she thinks for herself. And she says, that's a dangerous thing to do. I might die if I do that. I'm not so sure that I want to do that. And this is the point where Mordecai reasons with her rather than commanding her anymore, much like parents, as their children grow up, begin to reason with them and help them understand why they should do what they should do rather than just expecting them to do it because they're told. Esther and Mordecai move into that phase of relationship as well. And she transitions then very quickly through all of that from passivity to activity at the end of chapter 4, and then, of course, moving into chapters 5 through 7. But at the end of chapter 4, she orders a fast of the Jewish people. She commands Mordecai, and he obeys her, which is a very remarkable change from how things had been previously. And this isn't to suggest that he's somehow subservient to her now, but that she is the queen, and he is her field general, you might say. And in this regard, he is obeying her orders and enacting them at the end of chapter 4. In chapter 5, she really begins to be an active person as she begins working through a plan on how to convince the king to save the people. And understand, this is a plan. This isn't her just flying by the seat of her royal gown, or as it's said sometimes, kind of chickening out when she gets to the moment and says, hey, let's have dinner instead. The king knows better than to think she's risking her life for dinner. And she says at the very beginning, come to the feast that I have prepared. And the king says, hurry, go get Haman so we can do this thing. And so this meal was prepared when she asked for the meal. The plan was to ask him to the meal in chapter 5. But then she asks him to a second meal. And that can look like, well, maybe she chickened out this time. But notice, if you look at the text there in Esther chapter 5, that she doesn't just ask him to a meal. It's more than an invitation to a meal. What she says is, if you're going to do what I ask, this thing that I keep putting off that we both know is really the important thing, that it's not about these meals. If you're going to do the thing that I ask, then come to a banquet that I'll prepare for you tomorrow, and then I'll do what you've told me to do. Which is brilliant because she's getting the king's confirmation before she even asks. And not only is she doing that, she flips things on their heads so that instead of her asking him, she's obeying what he has told her to do, which will, of course, play to his ego, which we'll talk about a little bit more there. So she has strategically designed all of this to win her favor with the king, to get Haman in a position where he has no recourse whatsoever, to make sure he's there at the moment when she makes the accusation, rather than allowing her to be absent and him to flip it back on her when she makes the accusation. The rhetoric is just brilliant in terms of keeping the king from being defensive by excluding any role that he had in things, by not letting the cat out of the bag too soon that it's Haman, so that the king can really think about his good buddy, but instead just builds up the momentum of his anger until that moment where it is a snowball rolling and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then at the last moment she cracks out the accusation like a whip and leaves Haman careening toward his destruction. And at the end of that scene, we're told that Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And that's a really remarkable change from chapter 2, where she's a pawn on someone else's chessboard. Now she is the queen who is free to move wherever she wants and do whatever she wants and has complete control of what's going on. And from there she moves to a phase of authority, where she becomes the executor of Haman's estate, where she empowers Mordecai and enriches Mordecai. Mordecai becomes the steward of Haman's estate on her behalf. It is her letter at the end of the book in Esther chapter 9 that establishes the Feast of Purim, the one grand Jewish feast, at least at this point, that was not in the law of Moses, is authorized on the word of Esther. And so she is a pretty remarkable character because of how she changes. Mordecai, however, is remarkable in his stability, that he is a very different kind of character. And in fact, sometimes, or I think that Mordecai is more important than we sometimes give him credit for. He is an incredibly significant character in the book of Esther. Remember that when Esther is introduced, and this is part of her passivity in Esther chapter 2, she's not really introduced. She is an appendix to the genealogy of Mordecai. We're being introduced to Mordecai in Esther chapter 2. We're told his genealogy and his history. And oh, by the way, he's raising up his cousin, Esther. And so he is introduced, but not only is he the one who's introduced and introduced first, he's also the one who shows up last in the book. It is his introduction that begins the heart of the story. It is the praise of him and his glory that concludes the story. And that by itself tells you that he's a pretty significant figure in the book. Of course, Esther acts and does what she has to do because he informs her and he persuades her. And without that impetus, who knows what she would have ever known, and if she did know, whether she would have ever acted. When he is glorified in chapter 6 is where the book turns upside down. We talked in an earlier one of these about the structure of the book of Esther, the reversals and such. It is that point where Mordecai is glorified that the book turns its direction and things begin to be reversed. He's the one who writes the edict that reverses Haman's first edict. Even though, of course, the laws can't be changed, he writes an edict that makes it very clear, line by line, comparing one with the other, that imperial authority and imperial power and imperial thought now rested behind this new edict, not the old one, which would send out a pretty significant message. He's the one who writes that. And it's worth noting, although this isn't in the book of Esther itself, that as time goes on, the Feast of Purim comes to be known, even by intertestamental times, as Mordecai's feast. And so those early Jews thought of him as an incredibly significant figure in the book as well. And part of the reason why he may be so significant in their minds is because he is something of an idealized figure. And in particular, he's an idealized diaspora figure. One of the great questions that the book of Esther is dealing with is, what of the Jews in the diaspora? You know, those who went back home earlier on, they know that God is with them. It was prophesied that God would be with them. And then you find in books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Haggai, and Zechariah, and Malachi that God is in fact with them. But what about all those Jews who didn't go home? What about those that stayed over in Susa, like Mordecai and Esther? What about those who were scattered in other places by the Assyrians, for example? What about them in their new communities all over the world? Well, one of the great lessons of the book of Esther is that God is their God as well, and God will continue to protect them as well. But there is a question of who's going to be their leadership. They are far away from the high priest. There is no king. Who's going to lead them? And in Mordecai, you find something of an idealized Jewish leader in a diaspora community. He is constantly in the book Mordecai the Jew. He is known by his ethnicity. We are reminded repeatedly that he is a Jewish figure. He cites this as the only reason that he gives as to why he will not bow to Haman. And as it is his main identifying figure, he then stands as something of a representative for the Jewish people. But he's also a person of wisdom and ingenuity. He rises to influence in a foreign culture. He's at the king's gate at the beginning of the story, even before he's promoted to prime minister. And the king's gate was a place of great importance, a place where justice was administered and contracts were signed and all sorts of business were done. And it probably indicates that he's some sort of authoritative figure even at the beginning of the book, before he's promoted, and then he'll be promoted as well. He has incredible knowledge about what's going on in the book. One of the great mysteries of the book of Esther is how on earth does Mordecai know the sorts of things that he knows? In chapter 2, he knows what's going on with Esther in this contest. At the end of chapter 2, he discovers an assassination plot against the king's life. He finds out somehow the exact sum of money that the Jews were sold for. You read about that in chapter 4, of course, the selling being the amount of money that Haman was going to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He has political savvy to compose a decree that will avert the disaster. He has the social perceptiveness to direct Esther in what to do, to lead the people after Esther comes up with a plan, and then along with her direct the people in a new ritual to celebrate all of this at the end. He's a pretty incredible person when you stop and look at all the different things that he does throughout the book. He's also a person of pride and courage and loyalty. And loyalty here, I mean particularly loyalty to the community around him, a Jeremiah 29, seek the peace of the city that you're a part of sort of loyalty. Now, there is a national pride that is, again, indicated in his overt Jewishness and perhaps in his refusal to bow on the basis of that. But he is loyal to the king. He serves the kingdom by serving the king. And when he finds out there's an assassination plot against the king's life, he takes steps to solve that. When he knows that the Jews are endangered, he takes steps to avert that, and so he's loyal to his own people. But even then, there's a loyalty to the king because Esther is in the throne room, and not only is she his relative, she's also the king's wife. And so there's a loyalty in a variety of directions that you might think of with him, and the courage never varying in his course and what he feels that he should do. He's a leader, as we talked about already, with no prophet, no priest, no king in the diaspora who will lead. Well, Mordecai is for the diaspora community of Susa what Ezra was for those who returned. And notice how he leads. He leads by influence, not by coercion, showing that sort of true power rather than just brute force. But his loyalty in particular, of course, is for his own people, which certainly would have been an ideal sort of trait for a diaspora leader to have. He acts on their behalf. He pulls whatever strings that he can pull. He wields what power he can wield to help them in whatever way that he can help them. And of course, when he does become a person of power and influence in the kingdom, he uses that to seek their welfare. And we're told that at the very ending of the book, in chapter 10, that short postscript of an ending, we're told that he sought the welfare, sought the peace of his people, taking that, again, Jeremiah 29 principle and applying it specifically to the Jewish people, though I presume that he did it for the community at large as well. There's also a lack of personal ambition in Mordecai. He is a palace official of some sort at the beginning, I think we can rightly presume, but he's not one who strives for personal advancement. When he tells Esther in chapter 2 not to reveal her identity or their relationship with each other when she is first brought into this contest, that is something that can only hurt his chances for personal advancement. It can only hurt his chances for promotion. Presumably, as for her safety, we'll come back to that question in just a moment. But here is a great opportunity for him to advance his own career by her succeeding, and he takes no opportunity to do that as well. When he saves the king's life and the king forgets him, he demands no sort of reward, even though Persian monarchs were very well known for generously rewarding people, as you see in chapter 6, but also as you can see in history outside the Bible. Herodotus on many occasions records how generous these Persian monarchs were. For Mordecai to be overlooked is a shocking thing in that context, and Mordecai just lets it go. And then when it falls into his lap, it doesn't really affect him. You learn about a lack of personal ambition. His refusing to bow to Haman certainly is something that puts him at a risk of great loss. And like we said about his telling Esther to keep the relationship silent, we'll come back to this question again in just a moment. But whatever his reasons were, he's doing this for some principle or other, and it is disobeying the king because the king had issued a law about this, and he's slighting the prime minister, you might call him, and the two most powerful men in the world he's making angry, potentially, for a principle. And again, whatever else it is, it's a lack of personal ambition that is behind this. He's also a very direct person. He acts in a forthright manner. He's wise, he's cunning, but he's not devious. He never tries to get into the king's good graces or into Haman's good graces. When he has to convince Esther, he doesn't try to manipulate her. He gives her direct instructions, either as a parent telling her what to do or reasoning with her as a fellow adult. His plan is to directly ask the king to spare them, not to deceive the king or finagle a wish from him somehow, or to tell her to use her womanly wiles or something to get their way, but to just simply ask. And then finally, and this of course is always going to be something of a question in the book of Esther, he seems to be a person of faith. And you say it's a question in the book of Esther because there is no overt faith statement in the book of Esther. There's no overt reference to God, and we've talked about all that already, so I don't want to belabor that point. But he does say the two things that sound the most like faith statements. And in the canonical context of the book that we talked about already as well, I think you can reasonably read faith statements into the gaps of the wording of the book itself. But when he says deliverance will rise, when he says you've been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this, two of those most famous statements in the entire book of Esther are those that sound the most like faith statements, and they are found on the lips of Mordecai. Mordecai also is a person of great reserve. In addition to being an idealized figure in terms of his leadership, there's something idealized about him as well by us not knowing everything there is to know about him. This is a great contrast from both Haman and Ahasuerus that we'll talk about in just a moment. But we're not told everything about Mordecai, and in particular, we're not told those things that we probably would most like to know, those things which probably most call for an explanation of some kind or other. For example, when he tells Esther to hide her ethnicity, or when he refuses to bow. Aren't those the things you most want to know what's going on in the background? Why are you thinking this, Mordecai? Why are you commanding this? What exactly is going on here? And yet these are the places where you have the biggest silences. And so you read 5 commentaries and you walk away with 5 different speculative answers, one of which may be right, none of which may be right. Presumably he's trying to protect Esther in some way, but we don't know what his motivation was. Possibly Haman's expecting worship, and that's why he refuses to bow, but we don't know what Haman was expecting. We just don't know what's going on in these scenes. The only thing Mordecai ever says is, I won't bow because I'm a Jew, but is that because I'm a Jew and he's a Gentile? Is that because I'm a Jew and I only bow to God? Jews bow to other people. The only bow to God only is applicable if he's expecting worship, and again, we just don't know. And so those things we most would like to know, or where we don't have the answers. How did he react to being glorified by his nemesis in chapter 6, after he's led around on this parade wearing the king's clothes, riding the king's horse? All we're told is he goes back to his station, goes back to where he was, and, was he thrilled by it? Was he feeling vindicated by it? Was he grateful for it? Was he an obnoxious jerk about it? Was he feeling Godwardly directed? We just don't know, and that's one of the really intriguing things about Mordecai, are all the things that we don't know. Let me give you, it's a bit of a lengthy quote. I'm going to have a few of these through this. It's by a Jewish scholar named Michael V. Fox. I always have to clarify Michael V. Fox, who wrote a great book. I don't agree with everything in it by any stretch, but it's a great book called Character and Ideology in the Book of Esther, where, among other things, he does character studies, and I admit that I'm leaning heavily on his research and his work in putting this together and kind of distilling a lot of the things that he said and adding a little bit of my own as well. This is what he says about Mordecai. He says, Mordecai retains Mordecai retains a hard nub of inscrutability. Esther, I feel I can understand. My reading may be wrong or incomplete, but the point is not the adequacy of my reading, but rather my sense as a reader that I can know all there is to know about her. Xerxes has no silences. There's nothing to be silent about. We know this from the exposure of his shallowness in chapter 1. Mordecai, however, I cannot quite decipher. The author has carefully left a few dark spots that invite scrutiny but do not satisfy it. This technique makes Mordecai always deeper than the reader, and that in turn makes him a more effective exemplum. And so the point here is that Mordecai, again, ultimately is a great example figure. He's an idealized figure. He's the sort of people that leaders in a diaspora community should aspire to be like. But part of that is that he's a solid and unchanging character. He's not a character that will surprise us. He's reliable, he's stable, he's loyal, and he's a little bit mysterious. And all of those sorts of things are the perfect quality traits of a leader. Let's move on and talk about Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is very different from either Esther or Mordecai. He is, as the quote just indicated a second ago, a superficial character, first of all. You contrast him with everybody else. I mean, you have Haman, who we'll talk about momentarily, but Haman is scheming and brooding and fantasizing about his own glorification. Mordecai is taking precautions and making plans. Esther is afraid and taking courage and devising a strategy. Ahasuerus is just completely out there for everybody to see. He is easily read. He's easily read by you, the reader. He's also easily read by everyone around him. His princes know exactly what to say to solve his problem in chapter 1. His servants know exactly when he's feeling bad and what he's feeling bad about when they propose this plan to gather in all of the virgins. Haman can read him so well that he can propose an edict of genocide, and the king doesn't even bat an eye about it. A eunuch in chapter 7 reads him so well that he can have the prime minister executed on his own word. And of course, Esther in chapters 5 through 9 is playing him like a book, or reading him like a book, or playing him like a game, or mixing all of my metaphors together. But whatever the case may be, they're all in different ways bending this king to their wills. And they're doing that by seeing right through him and directing him to do what they want him to do. His motives, his attitudes, his thoughts are obvious to all of them. He has no sort of deeper resources to resist their flattery. And I should say something that I think I said at least a couple of these lessons ago about the satirical element of the story, that these Persian figures, Ahasuerus and Haman, are drawn satirically, which is to say you're supposed to laugh at them, and it's a book that mocks them. Now, this is not to say that historically this is all there was to these characters. Ahasuerus, who was also the same person as Xerxes, which you saw in the quote on the last slide, he is not as stupid as the book of Esther makes him look. But the author of Esther has chosen certain things from his life in order to paint him in a certain color, so to speak. And so when you read him in this book, he is a character to laugh at. He is really something of a buffoon throughout the entire story. So he's a superficial person, first of all. Secondly, he's a person who's obsessed with honor. This is very much one of these ancient shame and honor cultures where the most important thing you can do is accrue honor to yourself, and the worst thing you can do is be shamed, and you're constantly at pains to make sure you're accumulating honor and avoiding shame all the way through. Well, the banquets in chapter 1 are ways of flaunting his wealth and his honor to the empire. He's inviting the noblemen and the officials and even commoners from the city to come and admire the spectacle of his wealth and his extravagance. Now, this is probably because this is right before Xerxes goes on his Greek campaign, and it's to win their support for this and show them that he is able to do this great thing, even though it turns out he's not really able to do it, but history is another issue for another day. But this is to show off his grand honor, and as he's in the middle of putting all of his honors on display, he is dishonored by Queen Vashti, who says, "No, I don't think I'm interested in coming and showing off my beauty to all of the guys here." And so the law that is written as a response to this is that women must honor their husbands. So not that they must obey them, although I'm sure that will be part of it as well, but the language is that they must honor their husbands because that's what this king is obsessed with. When Haman comes to the king, he prods the king's ego. There's a group of people that need to die because they don't obey the king's laws. It is you that they are endangering. They're trying to shame you, and your honor will be supported by eradicating this people. And Esther does something very similar. As I click 1 second too soon, Esther does something very similar when she, in chapter 7, says, if we'd been merely sold as slaves, I wouldn't even waste your time, because our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. My entire race being sold into slavery wouldn't be worth wasting your time, because you're such a great king, and you would be losing so much by losing us as your slaves, and our affliction isn't worth comparing to that. And again, it's a way to appeal to his honor. Third, he's someone who is uncritically generous. And this generosity, of course, is to purchase honor. But you think about this, the feasts themselves in chapter 1, lavishing hospitality on those who come to witness his glory. The only law that he writes on his own, or one of two laws that he writes on his own, is there's no law about drinking. Drink as much as you want is the law that he writes. Then at Esther's coronation, he gives a tax holiday and gifts. Again, just giving and giving and giving. With Haman, go write whatever you want. Here's my signet ring. Here's a blank check. Go write whatever edict you want to write. We're talking about uncritical generosity. It's when someone comes into your office proposing genocide, and you say, yeah, sure, you just go write whatever you want to write, and I'm sure it'll be perfectly fine. And of course, the same thing's true with Esther. It works out in favor of the Jews this time, but when he's constantly telling her, yeah, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you, that's pretty uncritical generosity. When he agrees to what she's going to propose before he even hears what it is, simply by going to the second banquet, that's pretty uncritical in his generosity. And the same thing is true with Mordecai next, where after Haman and his, sudden out-of-nowhere promotion, and his giving him of the signet ring ended up so badly, his solution to it is to suddenly promote Mordecai and give him that very same signet ring to write whatever he wants to write. And again, it works out pretty well for the Jews the second time around, but it's pretty uncritically generous for him to do something like that. And then even his generosity toward the Jewish people kind of becomes the official record in chapter 9 and verse 25, where the story is told in a little bit of a different sort of way, the summary of what happened, where it kind of sounds like the king is the hero, and presumably what's going on there is that this is kind of the official record of what went out to all the people, what went in the Persian annals, which would have, pumped up the king a little bit more, and look at how great and how generous he was. Well, when you have someone who is, on the one hand, obsessed with honor, and on the other hand is uncritically generous, what that means is that pretty quickly their authority becomes irresponsible. You want people to like you and you have a lot of stuff to give away, it doesn't necessarily end well. Another way of saying it is the will of other people becomes law when you're dealing with a king. Memucan comes up with a great idea in chapter 1, or at least he thinks it's a great idea, and it becomes a law. Haman has a great idea, or at least he thinks it's a great idea, and that becomes law. Harbona the eunuch has a great idea, which actually is a pretty good idea, and while it doesn't become law, it is pretty irreversible when he says, Haman has gallows in his own backyard that he was going to use to kill Mordecai, whose word saved the king's life, and the king says, hang Haman on that. Certainly is an irreversible sort of edict as well. And then even with Esther and Mordecai, again in chapter 8, gives them the same blank check he gave Haman. It's great for the Jews the second time around, but it is still pretty irresponsible. This is a king who really never says no throughout the entire book of Esther. He surrenders his power to those who can push the right buttons. He is obsessed with the manifestation of authority, but he is indifferent to the practice of authority. Here is someone who is an all-powerful king, in worldly standards at least, who is constantly abdicating responsibility and surrendering that very power to whoever can stroke his ego, or who can appeal to his anxiety about his authority, or who can appeal to his desire to be generous. He's a terrifying figure is who he is, really, when you stop and you think about it. And part of that is because he's a lazy person as well. Doesn't spend energy, doesn't spend time or thought on much of anything. He follows everyone's advice without discussing it at all, and he seeks advice for everything without thinking at all. He acts without knowing what he's getting himself into or caring what he's getting himself into. He's so indifferent that he allows an edict of genocide to be written and then promptly forgets about it. I mean, have you stopped to think that when the king says in chapter 7, who is it that has done this thing, that's a really ridiculous moment in the story. How many edicts of genocide has he signed off on in the last week that he's forgotten about this one? So either he is trying to play stupid to protect himself, which certainly is possible, or he cares so little about what's going on in his own kingdom because of his laziness and his irresponsibility and his uncritical generosity and so forth, that he winds up being just this terrifying figure. Another way of saying it is that he is evil by his passivity. He doesn't have the same evil motives that Haman had. But evil is not just a trait of those people who initiate and perpetrate evil. It's also a trait of those who facilitate it by ignoring it or being passive about it in their company. Well, let me again summarize him with a quote from Michael Fox, who this time says, neither the narrator nor the Jews in the story condemns Xerxes, or even seems to resent his indifference to their existence. Xerxes is a lumpish, indifferent mass, not inherently vicious, not anti-Jewish, but erratic, childish, apathetic, and pliable. In this exemplary tale in which the persecutor of the Jews is a man of second rank, Xerxes is the epitome of the Gentile king, and as such, he embodies the power of the Gentile state. It is a severe indictment of that state that the author does not condemn the king as evil, does not use him as an example of a wicked king, but merely snickers, quietly, at his doltishness and egotism. Beneath the voice that lavishes admiration on the king's wealth and, in 925, flatters him for his solicitude toward the Jews, we hear another voice, more subtle and insidious, which by not denouncing his behavior, by taking it for granted that a despot will be of this sort, damns Gentile rule is scarcely worthy of contempt. I really wish we had more time to talk about that, because I think there's a lot of really interesting things to think about there, particularly there at the end in that last sentence. But we will need to move on for the sake of time. I'm nearly 35 minutes into this, and we still have to talk about Haman. Haman is a character whose chief trait is his transparency as well. He is devious, but he is allowed no mysteries. His motives, his drives, his attitudes are available for all of us to see. He is someone who is truly laid bare to the reader. Nothing is obscured. There's nothing for you to wonder about. His personal thoughts are quoted to you in this book. And what Fox says about this, I'll give you a short quote here that I don't have on the screen before a longer one later on. He says, evil, the author seems to say, speaking of his transparency, evil, the author seems to say, is really quite simple and obvious. However sneaky the evil man may be, and however subtle he may fancy himself. There's nothing new or clever about evil. It's pretty obvious when you stop and you think about it. And I think that's something else that's really worth thinking about and chewing on some as well. But as to Haman's transparency, it's seen in a lot of ways. First of all, his emotions are always on his sleeve. You always know what he's feeling. In chapter 3 and verse 5, he's filled with fury. In chapter 5 and verse 9, he's joyful and glad one moment, and then filled with wrath the next moment. In verse 10, you see him restraining himself from his emotions. In chapter 5 and verse 14, he's pleased by an idea that his wife suggests. In chapter 6 and verse 12, when he asks to honor Mordecai, he is mourning and has his head covered. In chapter 7 and verse 6, he's terrified before the king and the queen. Every time he has an emotion, you as the reader know exactly what that emotion is because the narrator tells you what it is. But not just are his emotions obvious, his thoughts are obvious to you as well. The nuances of his calculations are revealed. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone in chapter 3 and verse 6. His thoughts are quoted verbatim. Who would the king delight to honor more than me? In chapter 6 and verse 6. His perceptions are revealed to you. He saw that harm was determined against him by the king. In chapter 7 and verse 7. You also get to see kind of the wheels turning in Haman's mind and how his thought processes themselves work. In chapter 5, verses 9 through 14, you see his bloated pride and his obsession with Mordecai working itself out, not just in the emotions and not just in thoughts being quoted, but you can kind of see the mechanism of it as well. In chapter 6, in that conversation that he has with the king where neither one of them knows what the other one's talking about, you really get to see how his thought processes work in his prideful assumption that he alone would be the man the king delights to honor. There's no other character in the book that is as exposed as Haman is. Ahasuerus is superficial and simple, but Haman isn't so superficial and simple, yet he is laid bare before you at every single turn. Most of the people, you figure out who they are by what they say and by what they do, but the narrator reveals to us Haman in a direct and unambiguous way from beginning to end. He is, again, laying bare and throwing a very harsh light on Haman. And that means you get to see his motivations all the way through. And it is power and pride that motivate Haman. He's enraged when Mordecai refuses to bow. And because he has a giant ego, that means he has a giant injury to his pride, which means he has to have a giant reaction in turn. And so he can't just punish Mordecai. That allows Mordecai to have control over things. I've got to punish all of the Jewish people is where that leads to. He's relieved when his total revenge is set on its inexorable course, so he thinks, and he sits back and has a drink with the king at the end of chapter 3. He's thrilled to be a special guest at the queen's table in chapter 5. He brags about that to his wife and to his friends as he is boasting to them about his accomplishments. And this is just in itself one of the other ridiculous scenes in the book where he calls together the people who know him best and basically recites for them his resume. The one that just, really boggles your mind is he tells his wife about how many children they have, because she needs to know that, I guess. But what's going on here is his ego has taken a major hit. He has been shamed in a significant way, and so he's trying to comfort himself by boasting about how great he is. And even this does him no good as long as Mordecai is alive and won't bow to him. And so even there, Mordecai is robbing him of all the pleasures that he might derive from this honor that he has and the wealth that he has and the power that he glories in, because Mordecai has taken over his mind, and his power and pride are hurt as long as Mordecai is alive. Of course, the presumption, again, that he's the only person the king that could delight to honor fits into this as well. His desire to wear the king's clothes and ride the king's horse, which is tantamount to treason in the ancient world. It's asking to be a second king is what it is. That would fit in this as well. But what all of this means is that Haman is someone who desperately needs personal confirmation. His pride is not just smugness and self-satisfaction, although that's there as well, but he's a very fragile individual. His confidence is ready to be broken at any moment. He doesn't have satisfaction in his station. He's terrified that it's going to be taken away from him, and that's what is really driving all of this, and that's the terror of this kind of pride. He's also someone who is both clever and foolish. And that might seem like an odd combination of things, but it is both there. The cleverness is seen in chapter 3. I mean, the rhetoric that he uses to persuade Ahasuerus to kill an entire group of people is pretty impressive. It's a mixture of truth and lie, and it's ultimately fabricating this really big lie out of threads of truths and half-truths that play on the king's greed and malleability, so much so and so well done that the king ultimately agrees to this without even ever asking who it is that's going to be put to death. It's a pretty remarkable thing that he does, that he's able to pull off here, and to write an edict that is going to influence an empire even after he is dead and a counter edict has been written. There's still a lot of people that are willing to follow this one. The problem is that this cleverness is exhausted in chapter 3, and there's nothing left after it. And everything from that point forward is the foolishness beginning to manifest itself. His anger makes him unable to await his revenge, and so he tries to expedite things for Mordecai. He tries to kill him prematurely, and ultimately then erects the very instrument of his own death. He rushes to the king to get it done, and in so doing rushes headlong into his own humiliation. The assumption that he's the only person worthy of honor is what makes a public fool out of him, as he's forced to lead his archenemy around on horseback as his personal herald, telling all of the city just how great Mordecai is. And surely this is exacerbated to the extreme, because surely everyone knows about this conflict. The people around are the ones that brought it up. Haman didn't notice that Mordecai wasn't bowing until the other people pointed out that Mordecai wasn't bowing. So surely they knew of the ongoing conflict. What must they have thought in this moment? Of course, it's his rash fall onto Esther's couch that becomes the immediate cause of his death. And this probably is another place where we see that Ahasuerus is a little bit more clever than the book of Esther presents him to be. Haman had already broken cultural standards by remaining behind to beg Esther for his life at all. The court etiquette demanded that anyone who's not the king stay like 7 steps away from the king if the king is present, and if the king is not present, you're not allowed to be in the same room as her. So when the king left, etiquette said he should have left as well, and he was endangering himself just by staying behind at all. And it's probably only his desperation that led him to stay behind when the king left. But for him to approach her couch and then to fall on it crossed all sorts of boundaries in the ancient world. And so when the king walked back in, he had there the means of getting rid of this problem. Now, my guess is that the king was not actually thinking that Haman was sexually assaulting his wife. It's possible, I suppose. But probably what's going on is the king leaves because he's got a real difficulty now. he has to decide between his wife and his prime minister, and deciding in favor of one or the other, whichever way you decide, it's going to cause some problems from a public relations sort of standpoint. But when he walks back in and Haman is that close to Esther personally and falling on her couch, Haman has given him his out. He doesn't have to execute Haman because Haman has attacked the Jewish people. That would be bad for the king since the king's signature is on that edict. Now he can execute Haman for assaulting the queen. And he probably knew what was going on here because I don't imagine that begging for your life can be mistaken as sexual assault. But he had his out. And so I think this is one of those spots where you see the king is a little bit more clever than you might have otherwise expected him to be. That's probably what's going on there. At least that's my reading of what's going on there. But again, Haman is just a terrible sort of person, of course, morally, but even as the story describes him, transparent and egotistical and ultimately foolish. And that's probably what would bother him the most. Of all the things that I've read on Esther over the last several years as I've done a lot of work in the book, one of the quotes that has stood out to me the most is this next one I'm going to show you from Fox's book, because I think it's so spot on in terms of describing the character of Haman and what would have bothered him the most. And again, how much deeper it is in thinking about evil and what evil really is. And this is what Fox says. He says, by making Haman superficial and silly, the author hits him where his sort would most feel it, in his pride. We can imagine how a person such as the one created in this book would feel about the way he is depicted. Haman would not be bothered by being shown to be deeply evil, but would be mortified to be revealed as an impulsive bungler. I'm reminded of Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, a satirical attack on Hitler, which showed the Fuhrer to be not only an evil and dangerous power, but also a gesticulating, screeching, frenetic ninny. Rather than attacking evil on its own terms, Chaplin, like the author of Esther, denigrated it by exposing it for what it most deeply fears to be: weak within and ludicrous without. Well, I've gone longer than I meant to, so I won't say anything else by way of conclusion, except thank you for listening, and I hope that this study has been helpful for you in your understanding of the book of Esther.